storm had arrived early, the kind of cold that didn't knock. It broke in, crashing through the trees, shattering silence, swallowing every breath in a white blur. Somewhere in that blizzard, barely bigger than a boot print, a tiny golden puppy shivered alone. No collar, no warmth, no name. He had been left behind, accidentally maybe, or forgotten, or worse, discarded. And now the wind was howling louder than his cries. He stumbled blindly through the snow, his fur caked with ice, his legs too short to push through the drifts. He wasn't trying to find home anymore. He was just trying to stay alive. That's when the earth beneath him shifted, not with a crack, but a hush, and out of the white came a shadow, massive, slow, and warm. It was an elephant, alone, wild, and walking directly toward him. The puppy didn't run. He couldn't. And the elephant, she didn't walk past. She stopped and wrapped her trunk around his tiny frozen body. Not to lift, but to hold. They had no words between them, only presence. The elephant stood still, her massive body shielding the puppy from the wind, her breath misting gently above his fur, like a mother exhaling peace. No one had trained her to do this. No one had asked her to. She simply chose to stay. Rangers watching from afar froze in disbelief. They had been tracking the elephant for days, worried she'd strayed from her herd. But what they saw now wasn't confusion, it was intention. She knelt slowly, massive knees folding like ancient trees bending to prey, and curled her trunk tighter around the trembling pup. They remained like that for hours. The snow didn't let up, but inside the curve of her body, the puppy's breathing steadied. His whimpering stopped. His little paws unfurled from the frozen knots they had become. And when the rangers finally approached, it wasn't the cold they feared. It was interrupting something sacred. Still, they had to act. The puppy needed care. The elephant needed to return to her herd. Gently, cautiously, they reached for the dog. And the elephant? She let them, not because she trusted humans, but because the puppy did. She touched her trunk to his fur one last time and stepped back. What no one expected was what happened next. The puppy, once frozen, once abandoned, refused to leave her side. At the rescue center, he cried. He wouldn't eat, wouldn't rest. So with trembling hearts, the rangers brought him back to the clearing, back to the place where presence had once saved him. And the elephant? She was there, waiting, not as a guardian, but as family. The bond they shared wasn't something taught. It was chosen, moment by moment, heartbeat by heartbeat, across the divide of instinct and understanding. The puppy began walking slightly ahead of her now, alert and proud, as if guarding the very being who had once sheltered him. And the elephant? She moved with a gentleness rarely seen in the wild, always aware of the tiny steps behind her, always mindful of where her feet landed. Sometimes at dusk, she would pause at a stream, her trunk coiling into the water to splash him softly, and he would bark in playful protest before circling her legs with joy. Their companionship became a mystery to those who saw them from afar. Locals whispered tales of the guardian elephant and her golden shadow, and rangers, even the most skeptical ones, began to document their movements like a legend in progress. What baffled everyone most was not just the survival of the puppy, but how the elephant seemed to thrive with him. Her path became more predictable. Her stress levels dropped. She stopped wandering aimlessly and returned to familiar areas as if the little creature beside her had become her compass. And perhaps he had. On one particularly cold night, months after their first meeting, the elephant stood atop a hill, her massive silhouette outlined by moonlight. At her feet, the dog had fallen asleep against her leg, curled into the space where the skin folded like a cradle. And in that stillness, with the wind brushing through the trees and the stars flickering like ancient memories, they looked not like an odd pair, but like something eternal. They had saved each other once. Now they belonged to each other, completely. Now they belonged to each other, completely. And with every passing day, that bond deepened, not out of need, but out of choice. The elephant would bring the puppy fruits she couldn't eat herself, gently dropping them before his paws. He in return would bark to warn her of distant noises, standing between her and anything unfamiliar, no matter how small he was. Once, when she was startled by a loud crack in the forest, it was the puppy who pressed against her leg, grounding her, reminding her she wasn't alone anymore. Their routines evolved. At dawn, they would walk to the riverbank. She would bathe and he would chase dragonflies, sometimes tripping into the shallow edges of the water while she watched, trunk swaying with what could only be amusement. And when night came, they curled up under the same tree, her massive frame forming a barrier against the wind while the pup snuggled in, safe in a warmth no fire could replicate. It was never about survival anymore. It was about belonging, about how two beings from opposite worlds could rewrite the meaning of family without a single shared word, only shared time. And over time, the forest began to notice them. Herds that once kept their distance now paused when passing, watching silently as the elephant dipped her trunk to nudge the puppy forward, as if guiding him through some invisible rite of belonging. Even the birds changed their song when the pair passed beneath the canopy. Less alarm, more curiosity. Rangers spoke in hushed tones, cameras in hand, trying to capture what words never could. One stormy evening, when the river swelled beyond its usual reach, the puppy was swept by a sudden current. In seconds, the elephant trumpeted, not in panic, but in a raw, commanding force that split through the storm. She plunged in after him, not caring for depth or danger, only for the tiny heartbeat she refused to lose. Her trunk wrapped around his soaked body, pulling him out and placing him on the dry bank. The puppy, coughing and shivering, looked up at her with wide, trembling eyes, and then licked her trunk. That single gesture, it quieted the entire jungle. They weren't just a miracle of nature anymore. They were a symbol of protection, of resilience, of love that didn't ask what you were, but who you were when it mattered most. People came from miles away hoping to catch a glimpse, but what they witnessed was more than a spectacle. It was a lesson, quiet and undeniable. A lesson about what it means to stand by someone, not because you share blood, but because you choose to. The elephant didn't owe the puppy anything. She had lost before. She had survived enough to know that attachments could be dangerous. But something in the way he whimpered in his sleep, curled up beside her massive foot, had rewritten her instincts. Instead of guarding herself, she guarded him. And in return, he never left her side. They began moving through the jungle, not as an odd pair, but as a unit. She shielded him from the midday heat with the shadow of her body. He barked to alert her of anything unusual, his tiny voice rising like an alarm that never failed to draw her attention. And sometimes, when dusk fell and the world turned golden, he'd fall asleep beneath her belly, safe, weightless, protected. Scientists tried to make sense of it. They cited trauma bonds, neural mirroring, even pheromonal imprinting. But no study could explain how the elephant had once cried at the edge of a trench where her calf had died years ago, and now in the very same clearing stood watch over a creature 1,000 times smaller than what she'd lost. It wasn't science, it was choice, a decision to love when survival taught her not to, a decision to stay when nature gave her every reason to walk away. And in that decision, something powerful was born, not just between them, but around them. Other animals began gathering. Herds rested closer. Birds nested nearby. It was as if the jungle itself softened in their presence, reminded of something ancient and essential. That strength, real strength, doesn't always roar. Sometimes it wraps around the weak and holds them still, and holds them still. In a world that often demands motion, reaction, defense, this pair chose stillness, chose peace. It wasn't the kind of story that made headlines or filled textbooks, but the forest knew. The wind carried it, the ground held it. Rangers who had patrolled the area for decades began to leave offerings, fruit, water, even hand-sewn blankets, near the grove where the elephant and the puppy rested. Not because they were pets, but because they were symbols of what happens when the strong protect the fragile, not out of duty, but out of empathy. One rainy afternoon, a flash flood swept through the southern valley. Chaos tore through the underbrush. Animals scattered. Trees snapped like twigs. And when the rangers returned days later to assess the damage, they found something that stopped them cold. The puppy had survived, wrapped in the curl of the elephant's trunk, sheltered beneath her collapsed body. She hadn't run. She hadn't tried to save herself. She had stayed. Even as the water rose, even as her strength gave out, she had chosen to remain still, holding the tiny heartbeat she had once warmed beside a fire. And in that final act, she passed on the greatest lesson of all, that love does not calculate, that compassion does not count the cost, that sometimes to change a life, all it takes is the decision to stay. And stay she had, through storm and silence, hunger and exhaustion. The forest bore witness to a loyalty so profound that even the harshest rains could not wash it away. When the waters receded, the grove was eerily quiet. No birdsong, no wind, just the faint imprint of a curled trunk in the mud and tiny paw prints nestled within. The puppy had emerged dazed, shivering, but alive, because someone had chosen to be more than just strong. She had chosen to be kind. News of what happened traveled slowly, passed from ranger to villager, from whisper to wildfire. Locals began calling the area Sanctuary Hollow, not because of fences or protection, but because of what had been taught there, not in words but in presence. Rescue centers started including the story in training seminars. A mural was painted on the side of a rural school, a tiny puppy nestled against the chest of a massive elephant, eyes closed, breathing as one. No plaque marked the grove, no tourists visited, and yet to those who knew, who had seen with their own eyes or felt with their own hearts, it remained sacred ground, a reminder that even in the coldest, darkest moments, warmth could still find you. That strength was never about size but sacrifice, that somewhere in the wilderness, a giant once laid down her life for a trembling soul no one else noticed, and the land had not forgotten. The grove where it happened began to change, subtle at first. Plants that once withered now thrived. The soil held warmth longer into the night. Animals approached without fear, as if sensing the echo of a moment when love had been louder than instinct. Some said it was coincidence. Others whispered about spirits. But those who had seen her, who had watched the elephant lower her massive frame to shelter something so small, knew better. They spoke of her not with pity, but reverence, because she hadn't just saved a life. She had rewritten what power looked like, not through dominance or force, but through stillness, through staying. And the puppy, he grew, not into a wild thing, but into something gentler. He remained close to the grove, curling up each night near the tree where her body had once shielded him. He never barked, never strayed, as if he were guarding something sacred, or waiting for her presence to return. Not as sound or shadow, but in the hush between winds, in the stillness that remained. He never barked, never strayed, as if he were guarding something sacred, or waiting for her presence to return. Not as sound or shadow, but in the hush between winds, in the stillness that remained. People began to notice. Hikers who stumbled upon the grove often spoke in hushed voices after. They said it felt different, like walking into a cathedral made of trees. Some claimed they heard the rustle of leaves when no wind blew. Others found the puppy, now older, sitting beside the trunk, eyes closed, as though listening to something only he could hear. It wasn't eerie, it was humbling, as if the very air had memory and was trying to teach them what compassion really meant. Eventually, someone built a small wooden sign near the base of the tree. It didn't say much, just 5 words carved carefully into weathered oak. She stayed. He remembers. We learn. And over time, that sign became a place of pilgrimage, not for religion, but for reminder. Couples brought their children there. Elders sat and wept without shame. Volunteers left fresh water and food at the edge of the clearing. No one asked for thanks. No one sought attention. They simply came. And in coming, they carried her legacy forward, not by monument or speech, but by becoming gentler with each other. The puppy aged. His muzzle turned silver. His movements slowed. But he never left, not once, until the day his body, curled gently beside the tree, stilled completely. He had waited long enough. And in that final breath, the grove grew quiet again. not with grief, but with gratitude. Because for two fragile lives, once bound by fear and cold, something extraordinary had bloomed in the heart of nowhere, something that would never die. Because what had taken root in that forgotten grove wasn't just memory, it was transformation. The kind born not from triumph, but from tenderness. From a single impossible moment when a 5-ton elephant wrapped her trunk around a trembling pup and changed everything. Over the years, rangers who knew the story began telling it to newcomers, not as a tale of animal behavior, but as a lesson in presence. It wasn't about instinct, one of them would say. It was about choice. She chose to stay. That simple truth echoed through countless retellings. Teachers brought school children on quiet field trips. Scientists logged the unusual interspecies behavior. But even they, in their sterile reports, often wrote with reverence. And the puppy, he had become more than just a survivor. He was a symbol. His stillness beside the tree year after year wasn't a sign of waiting. It was devotion in its purest, quietest form. The kind that asked for nothing, that didn't need to be seen. But that changed people all the same. Some swore the air felt warmer in that grove, even on winter mornings. Some left letters at the tree's base, addressed not to gods or spirits, but to someone or something that had once remembered how to be gentle in a cruel world. And in that remembering, taught others how to do the same. And perhaps that was the most extraordinary part, that no monument had been built, no plaque hammered into the roots of that old tree, and yet everyone who stepped into that clearing, tourists, rangers, even locals walking their dogs, fell silent, as if they had entered something sacred. Not a place, a feeling, because deep down, they knew. What had happened there wasn't just survival, it was legacy. Not the kind carved into stone or preserved in museum wings, but the kind passed through presence, through a glance, a breath, a gesture as simple as staying close to something small and scared, even when the cold could kill you too. The story spread slowly, like frost creeping across glass. Someone posted a photo of the elephant and the pup beside each other. It went viral, but not in the usual way. There were no filters, no captions shouting for attention, just the image, quiet, reverent. And that was all it needed. A woman in Chicago framed the image above her fireplace. A teacher in Delhi started her ethics class with it every term. A paramedic in Oslo kept a copy folded in his wallet for reasons he could never explain. It had become more than a story. It had become a compass for anyone who'd ever wondered what love looks like when it's quiet. And through it all, the puppy, now older, slower, never left the grove. He didn't need to, because in that place he wasn't just a rescued dog, he was a witness, a keeper of the moment that changed everything. Not because he'd done something heroic, but because he'd been held, and that memory lived in him, quietly, like a song you hum without realizing. He would sit under the same tree each dusk, his aging eyes scanning the horizon, waiting, not for danger, not for food, but for the echo of a trunk, for the whisper of presence, for the return of the one who had once wrapped the world around him in silence and warmth. Locals began to call him Echo, not because he barked, he rarely did, but because he was what remained, of a story too sacred to shout, of a bond that had no name, no language, only proof. New calves were born in the grove. The herd returned each season, moving like a memory made of muscle and dust. And sometimes the matriarch herself, the very one who had once wrapped her trunk around a freezing puppy, would pause beside him. Not as a gesture, but as recognition. They would stand like that, the dog and the elephant, breathing the same air, sharing the same weightless stillness, as if to say, I remember. And that was enough, because legacy doesn't always thunder. Sometimes it waits in the quiet, in a field where snow once threatened to erase everything, where one act of warmth became a beacon for years. And it all started with a trunk, a breath, a choice not to leave. Because while the world often celebrated strength in roars and storms, here strength had curled itself gently around a shivering form and stayed, through the cold, through the dark, through the long, silent waiting that followed. Echo never wandered far from that grove again. Not because he couldn't, but because he didn't need to. In that space, life continued. Calves grew into bulls and seasons turned the grass from green to gold. Yet Echo remained a constant, a reminder. Children would pass by and ask, "Why does the dog live with the elephants?" And the elders would smile, their voices dropping to a hush. Because once, an elephant remembered what it meant to care. Even when he grew frail, when his paws trembled and his hearing faded, Echo never lost that look in his eyes. The one that said, "I know what it means to be chosen." And on the day he closed those eyes for the final time, he was not alone. The herd had gathered, quiet, reverent. The matriarch stood closest, her trunk resting gently over his tiny frame. Not to protect, not to comfort, but to honor. She didn't trumpet, the others didn't cry, but the wind that passed through the grove carried something sacred. Not grief, but gratitude. For once, a shivering life had been wrapped in mercy. And mercy never forgets. The grove became a place whispered about in stories, where giants once stood still for something smaller than themselves. Where a shivering pup had not only survived, but softened the hearts of those made of thunder and weight. Visitors would travel miles just to glimpse the strange harmony. An old dog lying peacefully among towering tusks, as if he had always belonged. And maybe he had. Because what Echo brought to the herd wasn't just presence, it was memory. Of a night so cold it could have taken life. Of a choice that rewrote what it meant to be strong. Of a moment when warmth didn't come from the sun, but from the silent resolve of an elephant who wrapped her trunk around something fragile and said, "Not this one, not today." And so the grove remained untouched, unhunted, unspoiled, a sacred corner of the world where strength bowed to stillness. And Echo, though gone, was never truly missing. Because in every gentle nudge, every slow step, every circle the elephants formed when one of their own was sick or scared, he was there, not in body, but in the way they stayed, just like he once had. It changed them, not all at once, and not in ways that could be counted or captured, but in pauses, in glances, in how the matriarch now lingered longer near the edges of the herd, listening for the sound of something small that might need her, in how the calves played closer to the ground, careful not to crush what they once overlooked. Even the old bull, once gruff and impatient, began to move with more awareness, as if somewhere beneath his massive feet, the memory of a shivering heartbeat still echoed in the soil. The transformation wasn't loud, it wasn't grand, but it was lasting. Because when something that small survives, because something that big chose to care, it leaves behind more than a story. It becomes a blueprint for compassion, for coexistence, for choosing presence over power. And the world, even in all its cold and chaos, became a little warmer. Simply because once, when the wind howled and the night threatened, one elephant had stayed, and one dog had trusted her. That trust, given so freely, so desperately, was what made all the difference. Not the act of saving, but the connection forged in the stillness between breaths, in the moment when the puppy didn't flinch but leaned in. It was in that silent agreement between species, spoken not in words but in warmth, that something ancient stirred. A reminder that survival is not just about strength or speed, but about being seen. And from that day forward, the puppy, small, still limping, but very much alive, became more than just a rescued animal. He became a symbol, not just to the herd, but to every creature who saw them walk together. The way he trotted beside the elephants, head held high. The way she would slow down so he could keep up. They weren't alike in size or sound, but they moved in harmony, as if their very steps rewrote the rules of belonging. They reminded the world that love doesn't require likeness, that safety isn't about walls, but about hearts willing to stay, that sometimes the smallest life can reshape the biggest legacy, because in that frozen night, where one could have left and the other could have given up, they stayed. Together, they became more than a story. They became a truth that traveled beyond the forest, whispered between trees and echoed in the hush of open plains. The puppy, once on the edge of death, now carried with him a quiet dignity, not because he had survived, but because someone had wrapped their strength around his weakness and called it enough. And the elephant, once only a guardian of her own kind, had chosen to extend her love beyond the lines of blood and species. They rested side by side, often under the same tree where she had first found him, the puppy curled against her massive side, his tiny chest rising and falling in rhythm with her deep ancient breaths. He would nuzzle into the folds of her skin, and she would lower her trunk gently, as if remembering that first night, when the world was cruel, the cold was bitter, and compassion had changed everything. Visitors would come and marvel. Rangers would take notes, but none could fully explain what had happened that night. They called it instinct, chance, anomaly. But the herd knew better. The forest knew better. Even the wind seemed to slow whenever it passed over the two of them, pausing almost reverently. Because what they had built couldn't be studied, it could only be felt. And those who stood close enough, quiet enough, could feel it too. The warmth of mercy, the echo of survival, the weightless, wordless bond between a life nearly lost and a heart brave enough to stay. That bond began to transform more than just the two souls who shared it. It changed the rhythms of the herd. The other elephants, at first uncertain, even cautious, grew to accept the puppy as one of their own. Calves would trumpet and play beside him. Matriarchs would wait for him to catch up during long treks. And the old bull, who had never tolerated distractions, began to walk a little slower whenever the puppy fell behind. The forest adapted too. Birds no longer scattered when they passed. Deer stood still. Even the predators, those who relied on instinct and hunger, watched from a distance, as if sensing something sacred was walking through their world. Something that didn't challenge the laws of nature, but reminded them that mercy could exist within it. And for the puppy, life took on a new texture. Nights were no longer cold. Hunger no longer threatened. He learned the language of stomps and rumbles, of silence and stillness. He knew when his guardian was alert, when she was at ease, when she was hurting. And in return, he gave her something no one else ever had: trust without expectation, love without question. There were days when she would simply stop walking and stand beneath a tree, her trunk wrapped loosely around the puppy, not for protection, but for presence. No danger lurked, no storm approached, and yet she stood there as if to say, "You still matter. I still see you. I still choose you." They became a quiet legend, not of war or conquest, but of healing. And those who were lucky enough to see them never forgot. Because it wasn't just an elephant and a puppy, they were a living memory of what kindness could look like, even in a world that had forgotten how to be kind. Rangers began documenting their journey, not just with cameras but in their notebooks, sketching the way the puppy would sleep between her massive legs, or how she'd nudge him gently when it was time to move. They called her the Guardian, and him, they simply called him Hope. Children would sit around campfires and whisper stories about them, as if speaking too loudly might break the magic. Tourists, once obsessed with snapping dramatic photos, would put their cameras down just to watch them walk by, quietly, reverently, as if in the presence of something holy. And even the wind seemed to carry their rhythm. One ranger wrote, "I've seen her stare into the trees for hours with that pup curled beneath her, not alert, not scared, just present, as if the world didn't need saving, just witnessing." The puppy grew, of course, his legs stronger, his eyes wiser. But he never left her side. Through dry seasons and heavy rains, he was there. Through migrations and losses, through births and goodbyes. And the elephant, older now, a little slower, still carried herself with the same quiet grace, still watched the skies, still listened to the wind, but never alone. Because somehow in that snow-covered night long ago, when a puppy curled beneath a giant's chest and trembled until he didn't, something unspoken had been promised, and neither of them had broken it. Because it wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about meaning, about choosing to stay when leaving would have been easier. About standing still in a moving world, not because they were stuck, but because they'd found something worth anchoring to. The puppy no longer trembled, not even during the thunder or when unfamiliar humans approached. He had learned that safety didn't always come from walls or cages, but sometimes from something as soft and powerful as the curve of a trunk around your body. And the elephant, who once lived among sorrow and silence, now walked with purpose again. Her herd had accepted the puppy as one of their own. Calves played with him, matriarchs waited for him to catch up, and in return he guarded them fiercely, his small bark echoing in the valleys like a promise that even the tiniest voice could matter. They became a symbol. Rangers whispered about them during their rounds. That's not just an elephant and a dog, one would say. That's what love looks like, when it stops asking questions. When a flood came and forced the herd to cross a dangerously rising river, it was the puppy who barked at the frightened calves to follow the matriarch. When poachers were spotted nearby, it was the elephant who shielded him under her body, ready to fight if she had to. They had saved each other once, and now they were doing it again, every day. Not with grand gestures, but with presence, with small, constant acts of loyalty that didn't need to be seen to matter. Because love in its truest form isn't loud. It's steady, silent, enduring, just like them. Because love in its truest form isn't loud. It's steady, silent, enduring. And as the seasons changed, rains came and went, rivers dried and flooded, new calves were born and old matriarchs passed. The bond between the elephant and the puppy remained untouched by time. Tourists occasionally caught glimpses of them. The towering elephant with wise, watchful eyes, and the small, scrappy dog who walked beside her with the confidence of a king. They didn't perform for cameras. They didn't chase attention. They simply existed, together. One ranger who had followed their journey from the beginning once said, "I used to believe nature was cruel by default, but then I saw them." His voice had cracked when he added, "And now, I think maybe we've been looking at it all wrong." Because the elephant who had once buried her sorrow in silence had chosen to carry something fragile again. And the puppy who had been thrown away like trash had grown into a guardian, not just of her, but of an entire herd, an entire valley. The world didn't change overnight because of them, but for those who witnessed their journey, for those who saw what it means to be held when broken, to be warmed when frozen, to be loved without condition, it changed forever. And in the wild, unpredictable rhythm of the savannah, that change was enough. It echoed in the quiet spaces between trumpet calls and soft barks, in the way calves gathered a little closer when the puppy lay down, in the way the elephant paused just slightly when he barked at something unseen, a language without words, but spoken perfectly, every day, by them. They were never meant to meet, not in the rules of nature, not in the blueprints of species or survival, but somehow they had. And in that meeting, something ancient was rewritten, not by force, not by fear, but by quiet, unwavering presence. The elephant had once been a shadow of herself, carrying grief that no herd could touch. And the puppy had once been just another victim of human neglect, abandoned to freeze in the dirt. But together they had become something else entirely. They had become home. Years later, when the elephant passed, old, weathered, and at peace, it was said the puppy didn't leave her side for 3 days, not even to eat. And when he finally did, he wasn't the same, slower, quieter, but still walking the same paths they once did. Alone now, but carrying something with him, a story, a lesson, a legacy not of power or speed or dominance, but of mercy. And sometimes on windless mornings, rangers would swear they heard it, the soft thud of a trunk brushing earth, the quiet patter of small feet beside it, because not all love dies. Some of it simply walks on, together, even after the last step. If this story moved you, share it, because sometimes the quietest bonds leave the loudest echoes.